January 1944. Southern Italy. Cold rain drifts across a ruined orchard on the outskirts of a village whose name has already been erased by artillery maps. The sky is low, heavy, colorless. Mud swallows boots. Splintered stone walls lean inward as if listening. And in the shallow depressions carved by shellfire, American infantry crouch beneath the hiss of incoming rounds. German mortars walk steadily across the field, each impact shoving air and earth outward in violent pulses. Shrapnel flicks through branches stripped bare by winter. The first sergeant glances once toward the ridge, no orders yet, only the sharp, metallic rhythm of fire striking the ground around them. Standard doctrine in most Allied armies would demand holding position, minimizing exposure, waiting for artillery or armor to shift the balance. A defensive coil, a pause, a calculation. But in the American line, something else moves. A practiced reflex formed through training that prizes momentum over shelter. Officers confer in curt motions. Riflemen steady their breaths. Machine gun teams hoist their weapons from the mud. Within seconds, the formation pivots not backward into cover, but forward into the rising smoke. The world that produced this split in battlefield instinct had been forming long before the orchard in Italy. To understand why Americans surged forward while other Allied troops instinctively tightened into cover, the narrative must return to the uneasy decades between the two world wars, years when doctrines hardened into identity. In Europe, the memory of the Western Front never faded. The Somme, Passchendaele, Verdun, names that carried entire nations' trauma, left deep marks on British and French command thinking. Millions had died in offensives that achieved little. The lesson many officers carried into the interwar years was simple: exposure kills, movement kills, aggression without overwhelming fire support kills. Armies that had survived 1914 to 1918 rebuilt themselves around caution, entrenchment, controlled withdrawals, methodical fire plans, and a near-religious reliance on artillery preparation. Protection first, maneuver only when absolutely necessary. This mindset grew into formal doctrine, reinforced by veterans who had learned survival in the mud. Across the Atlantic, the American experience diverged. The US had entered World War I late, fought intensely for a shorter period, and emerged with a different cultural memory. Instead of 4 years of attrition, American officers remembered the final months: open warfare, rapid maneuvers, and infantry pushing forward, under the belief that violence of action could break stalemates. Pershing's insistence on offensive spirit hardened into institutional confidence in the decisive attack. The U.S. Army spent the interwar years studying mobility, combined arms cooperation, and the role of decentralized decision-making. Even as budgets shrank, the intellectual focus remained on movement. By the late 1930s, global tension made doctrinal identity matter. Germany perfected blitzkrieg, speed, armor, close air support, exploiting precisely the kind of hesitation European allies had institutionalized. When Poland collapsed in weeks and France fell in 1940, the shock reinforced Allied caution rather than breaking it. Surviving such blows required defensive instinct. To move was to risk annihilation. To hold was to preserve the army for future battles. These patterns became reflex. American forces, still building strength and untested by early disasters, entered the war with a different intellectual inheritance. Their manuals emphasized counterattack as the fastest way to regain initiative. An enemy assault was not only a threat but also an opportunity, a moment when the opposing force was exposed, extended, and vulnerable. This shaped training programs from the platoon level upward: seize fire superiority, close distance, overwhelm before the enemy consolidates. Junior leaders were encouraged to act without waiting for higher command if the situation demanded it. The clash of these cultures became visible as soon as US troops arrived in operational theaters. In 1942, when American units joined the British in North Africa, the contrast was immediate. British commanders, shaped by years of desert warfare, preferred deliberate set pieces built around coordinated artillery. American officers, inexperienced but bold, pushed for aggressive advances. Resulting friction exposed doctrinal fault lines. caution born of experience versus momentum born of theory, reinforced by national character. As German forces shifted pressure across continents, each Allied army reacted through its own historical lens. The British and French held tighter to positional warfare, seeking control through defense. The Americans leaned into maneuver, seeking control through initiative. These differences lived not just in orders, but in instinct. From this mix of cultures, memories, and doctrines emerged the battlefield behaviors that would collide repeatedly through 1943 and 1944, setting the stage for the deeper roots behind the American reflex to counterattack immediately. The Allied coalition entered 1943 carrying uneven scars. Each nation brought its own battlefield grammar, shaped not only by memory but by geography, politics, and military structure. These variations became unmistakable once the war expanded into multiple simultaneous fronts. Britain moved through the conflict with a calculated patience. The Empire's manpower pool, though global, was not infinite. Every battalion lost represented both a tactical setback and a political one. British commanders had internalized the need to preserve combat power for long wars. They built doctrine around minimizing unnecessary exposure. The result was a system that valued coordinated fire, deliberate planning, and methodical advances. It could be slow, but it was controlled. It imposed order on chaos. And it taught soldiers that taking cover first was not weakness, it was discipline. Shattered in 1940, carried deeper fractures. The pre-war army had been mentally anchored to static defense, embodied in the Maginot Line, and its collapse left survivors with a sharpened instinct toward caution. Many who later fought in North Africa under the reconstituted French forces operated with officers who had lived the trauma of rapid defeat. They understood too well the price of overextension. Cover, concealment, and stability remained core instincts, even as they adapted to the realities of mobile war. The Soviet Union existed at the far opposite extreme, defined by catastrophic losses and brutal offensives, but their context was geographically insulated from American combat culture. Their experiences would influence post-war thinking, but did not shape U.S. battlefield reflexes in the critical years of 1942-44. American forces, meanwhile, entered the Mediterranean and European theaters with a doctrinal structure that rewarded initiative and punished hesitation. The U.S. Army grew at unprecedented speed, pulling in millions of recruits, many of whom had no memory of the Great War. They were imprinted instead with an institutional philosophy: wars are won by taking ground, not yielding it. Leaders trained at Fort Benning and other schools were taught that when struck, a unit should regain momentum immediately. A counterattack, if launched quickly, could shock an enemy, disrupt their plan, and reset the tactical balance. The first months of American combat exposed the growing pains of this philosophy. Tunisia in early 1943 revealed how inexperience and doctrinal boldness could collide with seasoned German units. The defeat at Kasserine Pass showed that aggression without cohesion collapses under fire. Yet the US response to that disaster was telling. Instead of retreating into caution, American training cadres doubled down on aggressiveness, reorganizing command structures, refining combined arms coordination, and emphasizing rapid decision-making at lower levels. The instinct to counterattack did not weaken. It sharpened. By the time US forces reached Sicily, Italy, and the Pacific Islands, this instinct had matured into a defining characteristic. When under sudden attack, whether by German infantry probing at night or Japanese units attempting shock assaults, American troops often reacted with instantaneous forward pressure. Fire superiority followed by movement. Movement followed by disruption. Disruption followed by regained initiative. This ran parallel to, but not always in harmony with, the operational preferences of other allies. British commanders sometimes viewed American reactions as impulsive. Americans sometimes viewed British caution as hesitancy. But beneath these tensions lay the deeper truth: each army was acting exactly as its doctrine and history had shaped it to act. By 1944, these differences became fully visible on every front where the Allies fought side by side. And those contrasting instincts, shelter versus strike, protect versus press, formed the framework that explains why Americans often counterattacked instantly, while other allies sought cover first. The roots established here now turn toward the specific angles that reveal how each layer of psychology, technology, leadership, and enemy pressure reinforced that divide. American soldiers entered the war with a cultural inheritance distinct from their European counterparts. Many came from rural backgrounds where self-reliance, decisiveness, and physical risk were normalized parts of life. Others came from industrial cities where action carried social value. The draft pulled men from every region, but the national character shaping them leaned toward confidence in initiative. Training amplified that instinct. In American infantry schools, instructors drilled the idea that waiting for perfect conditions invited disaster. Troops learned to push, probe, test, and respond with speed. Cover mattered, but only as a temporary pause before movement. When German or Japanese fire struck, American soldiers tended to react not by compressing inward, but by expanding outward, seeking angles, creating pressure, and refusing to yield physical or psychological ground. This became a reflex, not a conscious debate. In contrast, many British and French troops operated within emotional frameworks shaped by generational memory of catastrophic offensives. Their instinct preserved life through stability. The American instinct preserved initiative through motion. These differing emotional starting points shaped everything that followed. The United States entered the war with industrial capacity unmatched by any nation. That translated into reliable radios at lower echelons, abundant ammunition, motorized logistics, and a near-constant flow of replacement equipment. American platoons carried more automatic firepower than most Allied units. Their squads were built around a Browning automatic rifle, enabling immediate counterfire. Their motor pools allowed rapid repositioning. Their communication networks let junior leaders coordinate assaults without waiting for long chains of authorization. When struck, Americans had both the hardware and the logistical stability to push forward immediately. British forces, though well-equipped in certain areas, still operated within a more conservative logistical framework. French forces, especially early in the war, struggled with shortages and outdated systems. Technology dictated tempo, tempo dictated instinct, and instinct dictated whether a unit counterattacked or sought cover. American doctrine empowered junior officers and even non-commissioned officers with decision-making authority. The Army's leadership model assumed battlefield fluidity and required distributed judgment. A lieutenant could order a counterattack without waiting for a major or colonel. A sergeant could maneuver a squad to seize fire superiority. This autonomy turned aggressiveness into a natural response. British leadership culture, shaped by centuries of regimental hierarchy, centralized decisions more tightly. French structures were even more rigid before the collapse of 1940. When hit unexpectedly, European troops often waited for precise orders not because of fear, but because discipline had been built around controlled direction from above. Americans moved first because they were allowed, trained, expected to do so. German forces built their battlefield identity on rapid exploitation. Their infantry attacked in sharp thrusts, using machine guns, mortars, and infiltration tactics to break cohesion before a defender could stabilize. Against armies conditioned to hold ground first, this often worked. But when applied to Americans, the calculus shifted. German assaults depended on creating a window of shock, seconds or minutes in which defenders hesitated. American counterattack doctrine closed that window. By pushing forward immediately, US units disrupted German sequencing. Mortar teams were overrun before adjustments. Machine gun nests lost fields of fire. Assault squads suddenly found themselves receiving pressure instead of causing it. German reports repeatedly noted that American troops reacted faster than expected, often launching local counterattacks that forced German units to break off or regroup. The enemy's reliance on momentum made American aggression the most effective form of resistance. Where other allies absorbed the blow, Americans returned it instantly, stripping blitzkrieg of its rhythm. European allies carried the moral residue of the First World War. Their armies had seen entire generations lost in frontal assaults. That loss became cultural caution, a belief that minimizing exposure preserved the nation. For Britain and France, survival of the force was tied to survival of the state. Americans, unscarred by that particular trauma, carried a different moral equation. The best way to protect lives was to end the fight quickly. A fast, violent counterattack, even if costly, reduced prolonged attrition. American commanders often calculated that holding still invited artillery, while moving forward shattered the enemy's plan and reduced long-term losses. This moral calculus favored action. It taught soldiers that aggression was not disregard for life, but a pragmatic path to preserving it. Leaders like Patton, Ridgway, Harmon, and Collins crafted entire divisions and corps around the principle of continuous pressure. Patton demanded tempo so relentless that German officers later remarked on the Americans' refusal to pause. Ridgway drilled airborne troops until immediate counterattack became a non-negotiable instinct. Harmon pushed armored divisions to strike without delay after contact. These leaders didn't just preach aggressiveness. They engineered units whose structure, logistics, and command relationships made hesitation impossible. Their influence spread across the army, turning individual reflex into institutional signature. Across Europe and the Pacific, American units moved with an urgency rooted in leadership culture, not improvisation. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest, Belgium. Pre-dawn mist clung to the frozen pines, turning the landscape into a muted grey labyrinth. Snow-blanketed, shell-pocked roads, the hum of engines, low and mechanical, hinted at movement unseen. German armoured columns crept through the silent woods, aiming to pierce the thin American lines and divide Allied forces before resupply could arrive. Every shadow could conceal a Panther or Tiger tank. Every bend in the icy road was a potential ambush. American units manned foxholes, trenches, and makeshift barricades along key crossroads. Officers whispered last-minute checks, but hesitation was rare. Reports of German infiltration had already reached brigade level, and the doctrine ingrained over years of training and preparation demanded action. At 5:30, as first light struggled to filter through the dense canopy, a forward patrol engaged a German reconnaissance element. The response was immediate. Rifle teams pivoted, mortars were laid down, and tanks, those thinly stretched across the snowy roads, advanced to flank positions. The counterattack was not massive in scale yet, but it was swift, coordinated, and relentless. Across the forest, British and Canadian formations nearby reacted differently. They consolidated positions, brought up artillery, and waited for clarity. The contrast was stark. American units pressed, seeking to disrupt the German advance. European units held, seeking to absorb it. Within minutes, the dynamic created a feedback loop. The Germans, expecting a delay or a pause to regroup, were forced to react to the pressure. Their initial advantage, built on surprise and speed, began to erode under the American initiative. Units that might have advanced unchallenged now met organized resistance within moments. At the heart of this action were junior officers and non-commissioned leaders exercising decentralized authority. Lieutenants ordered squads into unexpected flanking positions. Sergeants coordinated combined arms suppression from foxholes and tank positions. Radio operators relayed fire missions forward in real time. Every movement was designed not to wait, but to preempt, disrupt, and reclaim initiative. The fog of battle, usually a paralyzing force, became a medium for American aggression. By mid-morning, local counterattacks had slowed German momentum along the northern approach to St. Vith. Tank tracks churned snow, rifle fire stitched the forest canopy with bursts of smoke and reflection. German commanders reported unanticipated aggression from units they had assumed would hold defensive posture. Each action reinforced the Americans' growing psychological and operational dominance. Yet the battle was far from over. The clash had escalated into a sustained confrontation, with lines fluctuating hour by hour, testing both American doctrine and resolve. By late afternoon, December 16th, the Ardennes battlefield had transformed from a quiet, snowy forest into a fragmented network of engagements. American units that had reacted instantly in the morning now consolidated gains, using each small success to extend pressure. Infantry squads, supported by light armor and artillery, pressed German reconnaissance units back into the wooded shadows, disrupting the flow of supply and communications that the blitzkrieg depended upon. The Germans had anticipated a window of hesitation, an opportunity to exploit thin American lines, but instead found themselves reacting to unpredictable, aggressive maneuvers. The decisive moment arrived near the crossroads town of St. Vith. German panzer divisions, attempting a concentrated thrust, ran into a defensive perimeter counterattack orchestrated entirely by American initiative. Without waiting for divisional orders, lieutenants coordinated tank infantry flanking movements. Mortar teams repositioned dynamically as fire plans shifted in real time. Communication lines crackled with updates, each report triggering further immediate action. The Germans were forced to halt, reorient and defend, turning an offensive into a defensive struggle. At 17-0, St. Vith remained in Allied hands, a critical point that had been expected to fall under the German timetable. What had been a probing advance became a bottleneck. Momentum reversed not by artillery or airstrikes alone, but by the Americans' instant, decentralized counterattacks. The operational consequences were immediate. German commanders recognized the lost initiative and altered orders under duress. Army units were redirected, supply lines extended, and infantry stretched thin. By pressing forward the moment contact was made, American units imposed a tempo that German doctrine could not absorb. Psychological effects mirrored the tactical. Confidence wavered, local coordination frayed, and hesitation began to infect subsequent German decisions. Where hesitation had been expected, aggression appeared. Where aggression was expected, hesitation ensued. Across the Ardennes, the contrasting behaviors of other Allied units became even more pronounced. British and Canadian forces maintained structured, measured defenses. Their firepower was solid, their discipline intact, yet the initiative gap left opportunities untapped. German units redirected to meet American pressure avoided immediate confrontation with European forces, underscoring how one army's speed of action could dictate the rhythm of an entire theater. By nightfall, the Ardennes counterattack had crystallized into a strategic turning point. The Germans, despite initial superiority in mobility and surprise, were compelled to slow and reorganize. The Americans' instinctive application of momentum had neutralized blitzkrieg advantage locally, demonstrating the operational power of a doctrine that valued immediate action over cautious calculation. The battle would continue for days, but the pattern was set. American counterattack tactics forced German adjustments, shifted operational priorities, and highlighted the psychological edge gained through rapid, decisive response. The immediate consequences of the Ardennes counterattacks were tangible, brutal, and revealing. American units had absorbed and redirected German pressure with a combination of speed, coordination, and audacity. Casualty reports tallied losses, both sides suffering under artillery, small arms, and armor fire, but the key measure was not only men lost, but momentum gained. US units held critical crossroads, disrupted supply lines, and forced German columns into piecemeal engagement. Commanders' logs reflected the unusual nature of resistance. German advances delayed hours or even days, often due to the instantaneous nature of American countermeasures rather than sheer numerical superiority. Reports from higher command underscored the impact on operational planning. General Eisenhower's staff noted that American units' rapid counterattacks had stabilized sectors that might otherwise have collapsed under concentrated German thrusts. Patton's communications highlighted how small, autonomous decisions by lieutenants and sergeants compounded into operational success. Conversely, Allied units, following more conservative doctrines, such as British and French contingents operating nearby, maintained defensive integrity but ceded the initiative. Their effectiveness remained unquestioned in terms of holding position. Yet in the fluid environment imposed by German tactics, measured defense often allowed the enemy temporary leverage before reinforcements arrived. The psychological effects were as consequential as the tactical outcomes. German soldiers recorded surprise at the immediacy of American reactions. Their training had prepared them for cautious resistance or delayed counteroffensives. They had not anticipated an opponent that would strike back instantly, even under heavy fire. This constant pressure contributed to fatigue, disorientation, and breakdowns in unit cohesion. Within American ranks, confidence surged. Soldiers witnessed the tangible payoff of training that rewarded initiative, reinforcing the cultural and doctrinal instincts drilled over years of preparation. success bred further audacity, establishing a positive feedback loop that would persist through subsequent engagements. Equipment performance also influenced outcomes. American logistics ensured that counter-attacking units were rarely undersupplied, allowing machine guns, mortars, and armored vehicles to sustain pressure without pause. German units, meanwhile, increasingly struggled with extended lines of communication and supply shortages. Mobility and initiative were supported materially, as well as doctrinally. Reports emphasize that such integration of doctrine, technology, and human decision-making amplified the effects of immediate action, whereas units lacking one or more of these elements, often other allies, could not match the tempo. By nightfall, both the immediate tactical map and higher-level strategic considerations reflected the consequences of instant counterattack. German plans were delayed, operations recalibrated, and local dominance contested in ways that slower, defensive approaches could not replicate. These initial hours foreshadowed larger doctrinal shifts. Allied planners now recognized that American methods provided not only local tactical advantage, but operational leverage across the theater. The stage was set for a broader evaluation of how aggressive, initiative-driven doctrine could shape the final phases of the European war. The long-term consequences of these immediate counterattacks extended beyond the Ardennes. American doctrine, validated under combat conditions, began to influence Allied operational planning at higher echelons. Staff analyses highlighted the strategic utility of decentralized decision-making. Units capable of reacting without awaiting orders created continuous pressure that disrupted enemy momentum, a force multiplier in fluid battles. Eisenhower and his generals noted that rapid American counterattacks could stabilize entire sectors, allowing other Allied formations to operate with greater security, even if they remained in more cautious, static postures. The German response to repeated American aggressiveness forced operational recalibrations. Blitzkrieg tactics, previously reliant on speed and shock, encountered a persistent resistance that exploited the Americans' initiative-driven doctrine. Armored units could no longer assume unopposed advances. Infantry engagements were unpredictable. Supply lines became vulnerable to rapid counterstrokes. German after-action reports repeatedly stressed that the Americans do not pause, a recognition of doctrinal and psychological impact as much as tactical performance. Allied armies observed these effects closely. British and Canadian forces, while retaining their emphasis on methodical firepower-based defense, began integrating lessons on rapid reaction and localized counterattack. Combined operations increasingly relied on American units to seize initiative where hesitation could have allowed enemy breakthroughs. In subsequent campaigns, Normandy, the Rhineland, and ultimately the push into Germany, coordinated efforts highlighted the contrast. American aggressiveness complemented Allied stability, producing a balance between momentum and attrition. Doctrine evolved. American units institutionalized the principle of immediate counterattack at every level, from platoon to corps. Training manuals codified rapid response, junior officer autonomy, and integration of firepower with mobility. Logistical frameworks were adjusted to ensure that supplies, reinforcements, and communication could sustain the tempo demanded by instantaneous action. Success at St. Vith and similar encounters validated these changes. Aggressive action not only restored initiative but also reshaped operational expectations across the theater. The human and psychological dimensions persisted. Soldiers internalized the belief that hesitation equated to lost opportunity. Commanders learned to anticipate and exploit enemy expectations of delay. Across theaters, immediate counterattack became a signature of American identity in World War II, an identity that combined doctrinal clarity, technological support, and cultural instinct. By forcing the Germans to react to American momentum, the Allies gained both tactical victories and enduring operational leverage, demonstrating that doctrine rooted in initiative could decisively influence the rhythm and outcome of modern warfare. The Ardennes counterattacks illustrate a fundamental truth about warfare. Tempo shapes outcome as much as firepower. Where hesitation might preserve a formation in the short term, decisive, immediate action can seize both space and psychological advantage. American forces in 1944 exemplified this principle, blending doctrine, culture, and technology into a reflexive aggression that disrupted the enemy before they could consolidate gains. In contrast, allies shaped by prior trauma and centralized command prioritized preservation, revealing how historical memory and organizational structure influence split-second decisions. Beyond the battlefield, these contrasts influenced military thought for decades. Doctrine, once theoretical, proved its power when exercised instinctively under fire. Leadership style, the autonomy of junior officers, and the integration of mobility and firepower created a system in which initiative became an operational force multiplier. The Ardennes demonstrated that modern combat is as much about anticipating human response and decision-making as it is about equipment or numerical superiority. The moment is emblematic not simply for its tactical outcomes, but for what it revealed about the nature of military culture, psychology, and history. In immediate counterattack, the Americans codified a principle of war. To act swiftly, decisively, and relentlessly is to shape the battlefield itself. That instinct, born of doctrine and reinforced in combat, left an enduring imprint on Allied operations, on the enemy who faced it, and on the study of warfare that followed.